welcome to Parsons and to this first of our design dialogues of the year in the Stephan Weiss Lecture series. My name is Joel Towers, and I'm the Dean of Parsons, and I have the easiest job of the evening. And that job is to introduce Miodrag Mitrosinovic, who is the Dean of the School of Design Strategies. This is easy for a couple of reasons. One is that I used to have that job, and I know with great pleasure when Miodrag took over Design Strategies, I knew that it was not only in very good hands, but that he would be able to continue to develop the school in a way that was innovative, that took tremendous advantage of the remarkable faculty and the opportunities that those faculty bring to the School of Design Strategies and to Parsons as a whole. And the event this evening is an example of that. It's an example of, excuse me, it's an example of the kind of work that's been going on under Miodrag's leadership, under Jamer Hunt's leadership of this new program, which we'll be talking quite a bit about this evening, and which has been all over the place of late, virally and otherwise, and really points to new directions in design thinking, design education, and design strategies as a school has been able to lead out a number of innovations that I think wouldn't be possible in any other context. And we've been very fortunate to be supported by, among others, the Karen Weiss Foundation over the years in making this event tonight possible, and a whole series of events that we've been able to really leverage to the advancement of that foundation's mission and of our core mission at Parsons. And Miodrag will speak more to that issue. Miodrag is and one of the things that is also part of the tradition of this particular design dialogues is that we have initiated the introduction cycle in such a way so that the people who are speaking about the speakers before they begin not only are in depth and deeply connected to those individuals, but it's a way to look at the faculty of design strategies, and Jamer is a remarkable example of that, and I know that Miodrag will be speaking to that point. So Miodrag Mitrosinovic, the Dean of the School of Design Strategies, who was formerly the chair of Urban and Transdisciplinary Design in the school, has led out many of the initiatives around urban design and new programs in urban design at Parsons and at the university, is a tremendous scholar and colleague and leader of this school, and I am very pleased to be able to introduce him to you, Miodrag Mitrosinovic.
Thank you, Joel. Now I feel very embarrassed by this extremely generous introduction, but thank you. Always very kind and very generous. And I wish I can say it is a pleasure to inherit your job. No, I'm just kidding, just kidding, just kidding. But I'll try to be as short as possible, and also I cannot wait for the dialogue to start, so I'll just be short. First, a couple of things I have to say about the school and about the Stephan Weiss dialogues. The dialogues and the lectureship, Stephan Weiss Lectureship, was established in 2002 originally, at the time in the Department of Design and Management. In 2008, as some of you may recall, around here, that's ancient history, School of Design Strategies was formed, and Design and Management program was, or department, was one of the founding programs of the school. The school now is quite large. It counts about 1,400 students and 34 full-time faculty and about 150 part-time faculty. And it actually, what the school does is it tries to explore design as a twofold opportunity. One, as a core capability, and secondly, as a strategic asset in the practices of individuals, communities, groups, and organizations. The intention behind the Stephan Weiss dialogues and lectureship originally was to bring innovative design and business thinkers to Parsons, and originally again to the Design and Management program. But once the school was founded, what happened is that we renamed the lectureship from obviously lectureships to dialogues, sorry to be redundant. And the reason why we did that is also to move away from the traditional format where we bring innovative thinkers to actually address us in a very traditional and many would argue historically obsolete format, which is to lecture at us. And so what we decided to do last year is, or 2 years ago, last year, was to actually change this into dialogues, which is with the intention of both really pragmatically, but also metaphorically, in fact, indicate a shift to our ambition to create a discursive space around innovation, particularly at this evolving intersection or intersections of these, business and design. Obviously, needless to say, this significantly expanded both the lecturership and also something that I did not mention so far, which is the Journal of Design Strategies. What we decided also to do is to create a thematic dialogues. So each year, annual thematic dialogues. So each year we have 3 dialogues that address a particular thematic framework. This year we're working with transdisciplinarity. Therefore, Jamer Hunt, who is the chair of Transdisciplinary and Urban Design here at the School of Design Strategies, leads this effort and has been, of course, instrumental in bringing these dialogues together and organizing this entire thing. We are, needless to say, very grateful and continue to be very grateful to Karen Weiss Foundation for continuing to support our school and this programming, which for our school is also important in the following way, and this is going to be the last thing I'm going to say for not to take more time from the dialogue. What we are just about to do, and Jamer has been leading that effort for a couple of years now, is to launch a new graduate program in transdisciplinary design. The program is emerged out of, again, our idea and our ambition to not necessarily to lead as much as it is to, in fact, be at the cutting edge of educational institutions, design educational institutions, who are trying to explore the possibilities of design expanding beyond the traditional scopes and domains of design practice and design theory, and also design history in some ways, but also to figure out the ways in which design can begin to cross the boundaries and become, as I said at the very beginning, become a core capability of both individuals and groups in their ability to implement change in their own communities and their organizations. And so this program and this dialogue tonight and the dialogues this semester and Jamer's work in this, incredible work in this area, will, we hope, enable us to actually then provide some leadership to other educational institutions and other organizations across the spectrum in what we learned over the next couple of years in simply trying to create the space, inhabit the space, be happy with it, and also explore, do some in-depth research, and do particularly the research that we organize currently through research laboratories. And another new thing, as I promised, I'm not going to talk about anything else in detail, but particularly research laboratories. We have 7 research laboratories working right now under the leadership of indirect and direct leadership of 3 different chairs. Jamer Hunt is one of the chairs in the school. And we are trying to actually connect and create synergies in between the faculty, ongoing faculty research, particularly in the areas of transdisciplinary design, and the new graduate program we're creating, so that we bring the really, if some of you here are potential students of this our new MFA Transdisciplinary Design program, I should say that we cannot wait to begin to work and to have you around and create some really innovative space around transdisciplinarity and design. Okay. Thank you. I'm not going to talk about the speakers, and Jamer will do that. So I will then let Dr. Jamer Hunt to introduce the speakers and the series.
Thanks. We're almost ready to wrap up, I think. So I'm incredibly excited. Thank you all for coming out here tonight. This is a great occasion for me, a great occasion for all of us here and all of us at Parsons in the new school. It's really been an incredible privilege for me to be able to coordinate this series this year. I was 22 when I started, so it's been a little bit of work, but it's been fabulous. And to have the people that we have in this series is extraordinary for me, and it's just pure entertainment, if nothing else, and edification. I also want to express, our deep gratitude to the Karen Weiss Foundation, and if David Bressman and Corey Weiss are here, I wasn't able to catch up with them, but we are very grateful that you're here. I also want to mention that there are 2 other dates coming up. March 25th, we will have Machai Vogelsang of Proof and Machai Vogelsang Studio in Amsterdam, who is an eating designer. You will never have experienced such a person. And Andrew Blauvelt, who is a genius designer, curator, director of design at the Walker Art Center, one of the smartest people I know in design. That's going to be extraordinary. And then again on April 6th, we will have another with Natalie Jeremijenko, the conceptual designer and provocateur, and Nigel Snowd, who has held many positions coordinating information technology around disaster relief, including at Microsoft, if you can believe it. And I think it'll be an extraordinary night to really explore what it means to encounter disaster and complexity in these stressful situations through design. As both Joel and Miodrag have pointed out, this is really a big night for us. This is kind of our public coming out, so to speak, of the grad program in transdisciplinary design. And it's been, we've had a nice burst. The program is covered already now in Core 77 on Metropolis's blog and also in Fast Company today. So we've really, I think we've struck a chord, and it's a remarkable moment, both for the new school and for Parsons. Particularly because other schools, I think they think about interdisciplinary practice, they write about it, they dream about it. The nice thing is here is that Parsons made it happen, and I think that's extraordinary. It's rare that you get this opportunity to create something almost entirely new, and it's taken amazing leadership from Miodrag to Joel, but also to Tim Marshall, provost of the New School and former dean of Parsons, to really get this to happen. And the premise is really simple, I think, that we're constantly facing global challenges that really surpass any design discipline's ability to address them. And what we need then are new tools, new methods, new ways of working, and that's what I hope we'll inculcate there. And we need them to understand how we will continue to use water, a scarce resource, how we'll enhance city life, how we'll determine the boundaries of public and private, or how we'll deindustrialize healthcare, or how we'll reinvent infrastructure for the 21st century. So there are great and interesting and rich, frothy topics to dive into. And 2 people that I think will continue to kind of be leading lights in this are our 2 guests tonight, whom we can turn towards for inspiration. Anna Valtonen has a doctorate in industrial design from the University of Art and Design in Helsinki. She's the author of a very beautiful book on industrial design called Redefining Industrial Design, Changes in Design Practice in Finland, which I encourage you to find. She was for over 12 years at Nokia and director, ultimately, of the Design Research and Foresight program. She sits on the board of the Aalto University, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a brand new consortia of 3 institutions in Finland, universities of economics, of technology, and of her institution, the University of Art and Design. Extraordinary coming together, and I think something that's really a model and an inspiration for us in the transdisciplinary program. And she is a rector, and that's president to you and me of Umeå Institute of Design in Sweden. And I'm assuming that normally we would play some anthem or have a special handshake when you come up to speak, but I'm afraid you'll just get a plain old American welcome. Yochai Benkler, our other speaker tonight, his short bio was 386 words. I looked on his site. If that's short, he is the Berkman Professor of Entrepreneurial Legal Studies at Harvard. He's the faculty co-director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. His book, The Wealth of Networks, How Social Production Transforms Markets and Freedom, has won just about every important prize there is to win in his field, short of a Nobel Peace Prize. That may be coming next. And in fact, it was by Strategy and Business nominated as the best business book about the future. Think of that responsibility, to be, to sort of own the future, to have seen the future better than anybody else. I don't know how you get up in the morning. Remarkably and wistfully, he will have to leave at 7:30, but because he's going off to save net neutrality in meeting with a Prime Minister's seminar group in Paris tomorrow morning. So we have him for but a brief time. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Katie Salen, who will moderate tonight's conversation, our own Katie Salen from Parsons, Associate Professor in Design and Technology. She's a co-author of Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals, as well as the Game Design Reader. I would ask everyone, if they could, to please turn off their cell phones so we don't have to get interrupted in that ugly way. And I just want to leave you finally with an image to sort of get the conversation started about networks. Years ago, I was working on my sister's house, painting it one summer, and underneath an eave, I came across a spider's web. And I'm actually quite afraid of spiders. So I bumped the web, and there was this mass in the middle of the web, and the mass suddenly trickled out and then came back together. It's extraordinary. And so, I sort of fearfully touched the web again, went out, and came back again. And this was a mass of baby spiders, probably 100, 1,000 baby spiders that had all come together. And every time I tapped the web, they moved out and they came back again. That's a network. It's a network in its material sense, the web itself. It's a network in the biological sense. In some way, the genetic patterning of these insects enabled them to understand that they had to come back and forth together and apart. It's an embodied network. They felt the responses. The body felt the responses so that it knew to move out and move back. And finally, it's the network as a social connection. I'm assuming the spiders talk with one another. In any case, finally, we get to our extraordinary guests. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Joachim Winkler.
So thanks for that very overly kind introduction. I can't fail but disappoint. I don't talk usually in design school, so I'm sorry if my talk will end up being not beautiful. I do talk quite a bit to people who design legal institutions, people who design software systems, people who design organizational processes, and so I won't try to pretend. I'll say what I have to say, and you'll tell me whether it's interesting and useful to you. What I want to talk about in particular is cooperation and human cooperation, about loosely coupled systems, about human agency and freedom, its relationship to social dynamics in a context of change and unpredictability. And you think the short bio is many words. Let me start with something very industrial. This is a bad time to say nice things about Toyota, but I'll try to say them anyway. Once upon a time, people said Toyota production system was something unique and cultural to Japan. Then the GM plant in Fremont, California, which was one of the worst performing plants in the country, 20% absenteeism, etc., was bought out by Toyota, re-engineered with almost the entire same workforce, the entire same union leadership, but structured in a different way, putting together organizational, technical, institutional elements that together completely changed the dynamics so that it very quickly became the most productive, and since then, one of the 3 most productive plants in the US in terms of low error rates, in terms of lack of absenteeism, in terms of productivity. You had a shift organizationally from Taylorism, well-structured scientific management, embedded in a physical system through Fordism, and a legal system with the National Labor Relations Act, to Toyota production system organizationally with intense collaborative union negotiations in a much more team-structured workstation with a lot more fluidity around the workstation, integrating all 3 together. This particular approach of engaging multiple systems, institutional, organizational, technical, and social, in a single solution to structure human cooperation is what I want to talk about. And in particular, it plays an important role online, and I'll say why in a minute. So obviously, you've got the shift from Ma-Bell, everybody coming to a switch and being controlled at the middle, to a web that's completely decentralized and distributed, end-to-end. No one gets to control. No one gets to control the innovation. We have a series of institutional elements that basically say, as a matter of law, no one is permitted to control any particular point. We have a strong shift away from the idea of controlled and optimal systems, which are simply signified by the telephone system, to scruffy but robust learning and adaptive systems that are distributed and over which no one has control, so that a Dutch pirate software developer and his Estonian partner can come up and solve the problem of voice over IP through Skype that no one was able to or was willing to do it in the general system. It moves also to social systems. So if you look at Gary Becker, Nobel laureate in economics, characterizing crime in this classic rationalized form of criminals are rational, they will be prevented from acting if the penalty times the probability of detection will equal deterrence. Then, from the 80s on, as this fails, we see the emergence of community policing, which gives us again the opportunity to see how integrated systems design allows us to combine certain things. Technical, from being inside the steel cage to being on the street, in the beat, face-to-face. Organizational, instead of 911 with a centralized place to collect, sending out specific calls so that the immediate interaction face-to-face is always either with a victim or a perpetrator. You have this steady flow of people face-to-face with other people, together with monthly community meetings and agenda setting. Institutionally, the officers have a lot more room for discretion. And socially, you get the officers more humanized, changing the us-them boundaries, norms and local ability to negotiate with what counts as acceptable or not and what's important or not locally, taking a large role, and trust being built over time. And finally, we come to the net. Here's the model of the organization that is structured around authority, institutionally embedded in an idea of copyright and control over information, with authority based on being the Nobel laureate in this, the professor of what's its name in that, etc., versus this very open system that allows anyone to contribute whatever they want. Continuous communication, continuous negotiation of who controls what, delivering knowledge in completely different ways that are only enabled by the net. Basically, what I want to spend the time talking about is human systems, routinized interactions amongst objects and processes, institutions, organizations, technical platforms, conceptual frameworks that provide people affordances and constraints, where by affordance I mean a regularity of expected effect of behavior so that you can plan and execute within a system, and a constraint is essentially the inverse, and both are equally necessary, obviously, and I'm not going to go here, of all places, into that. By coupling, I mean the degree of completeness and determinism with which a system characterizes its input processes and outputs to connect action to outcome. And essentially what we have is this trade-off between predictability versus change on one hand, freedom as practical human agency, the ability to choose things, and loosely coupled system. And essentially you can have a period, and this is essentially I think what we saw throughout most of the latter part of the 20th century, you can have relatively stable systems with a relatively limited freedom of action being relatively predictable. And then as processes start to speed up and predictability is lost, you need more human agency in order to sense, adapt, innovate, change, which in turn requires that systems be more loosely coupled, determine less what happens, and that's essentially what you get with Toyota Production System, with a lot more innovation at the individual level. It's essentially what you get with innovation from the net that no longer comes from Bell Labs, but comes from everywhere in the net. It's essentially what you get with local communities trying to diagnose locally what it is that's happening and what it is that's breaking down and coming up with solutions. And you have systems being built that provide the affordances for that learning and adaptation in a distributed form. I'm sorry, I'm looking at this because this is my, like everybody else, this is my clock now. So essentially, we're moving from a late 19th to 3/4 of the 20th century rationalization through tightly bound systems to, in the last quarter of the 20th century, an effort to move away from hyper-structured and hierarchical system to just saying we're all responsive to incentives, and so it's equally simple. You don't have, you know, and it's deterministic. This is my favorite quote from Law and Economics. The expected utility of unsafe sex for M and for F is equal to the benefits of unsafe sex minus its expected costs, and is given by et cetera, et cetera. This is actually not a joke. This is a piece in a serious paper, peer-reviewed by one of the top practitioners of economic analysis of law from 15 years ago. Now, I'm not going to suggest a new critique of markets and bureaucracy, but what is interesting is that we're seeing increasingly a large number of books, both popular and academic, that are saying that there's a new mainstream inevitability of reorienting the relative advantages of markets, hierarchies, and social processes required for faster learning and innovation in a world that's increasingly pushing for innovation, which is resistant to full specification. And instead, what we're seeing is the emergence of the networked information economy, where there's radical decentralization of inputs and processes, both material and human. Processing, storage, computation, sensing, all of these are everywhere in everyone's hands, in the same place that also this other major issue of human creativity, wisdom, intuition, experience, and no less importantly, and this is what I'll spend the rest of the 10, 15 minutes on, sociability, the social processes that allow us to organize instead of using traditional hierarchical model or crisp pricing. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, the most important inputs into the core economic activities of the most advanced economies are widely distributed in the population. And social actions, the thing that we always used to do with each other as human beings, and were always important to cementing social bonds, move from the periphery of the economy to its core. The builders of amateur electric cars on the weekends never threatened GM because of the cost of the assembly line. The same is not true for the authors of Wikipedia or for the author of free and open source software because of this radical decentralization. This is also a lot of what's giving us a more participatory culture and arguments about a more democratic public sphere, which I'm happy to talk about later, but I won't emphasize here. Critically, we're seeing capacity and authority to act being located at the edges in loosely coupled systems that don't determine the outcome. What that means is that we need systems that enable people to self-motivate. We need systems that allow people to act out the social motivations that allow them to act when we remove both the command structures and the market hierarchies. So essentially, we need to think about human systems designed for cooperation, integrated rather than just interdisciplinary in the sense that you need to understand the relationship between the institutional system, as it were the legal, the organizational systems people are embodied in, the technical systems, the built environment, and the social systems that they all inhabit, because you can hand off different components of the behavior between these different systems if you understand how they all work together. So a lot of what I'm doing now is trying to look at what are the various sources, and I have lots of sources here, and I won't talk about them, as it turns out. This is, as I said, unfortunately not beautiful. In organizational sociology, in experimental economics, in political science, in anthropology, in social software, in human evolutionary biology, in neuroscience, what we're seeing, and this is the point, forget about what's there, is an intellectual arc that is roughly 15 years old, moving, so if we look at a longer arc, we see from the 50s, 60s, and 70s the rise of the idea of self-interested rationality as completely specifying human beings. People move to perfecting markets instead of perfected command hierarchies, and what we're seeing throughout all of these disciplines is more openness towards a more diverse set of human motivations, more openness towards the possibility that we're not all self-interested, though some of us are more of the time and others of us are less of the time, and all of us to some extent are some of the time. And that cooperation is sensitive to context. It's possible that some people are at baseline are more or less cooperative, but basically cooperation is also situational. The context And context manipulation can lead to greater compliance with cooperative behavior or deterioration to dog eat dog. This becomes a core design challenge for anyone, with whatever system. And I assume it's the systems you build as well. It's the question of how do we set up a context where people don't treat each other as, I don't know you and I can take advantage of you because I'm the one who is at stake, as opposed to we are in this together. There's a jump between the I and the thou. There's a connection. There's a sense of what it is that's moral, what it is that is fair, what it is that is appropriate. And the question becomes how we move from this general statement to a discrete set of design targets that say, how do we achieve, what is it, first of all, that we need to achieve, and how do we need to achieve it? So I don't know that I have that list, but that's the target of what I'm trying to do, synthesizing out of all of these different literatures, a set of mid-level abstractions that say, here are targets that we can in some sense feel or understand, and aim to build for them and see how they work. Essentially trying to extract a set of design levers to improve the degree to which a given group of people in a given situation will cooperate. So what are these? Most important across multiple disciplines you'll find is communication, both in the dialectic of people understanding even what it is that they want, and in the sense of once they know what they want, negotiating how they trade off their requirements, as well as essentially building all of the rest of the levers. The second is a class of design levers that go to intrinsic motivation or affective commitment to cooperate. That is to say, how do we get people to actually want to care about the other? How do we instigate empathy and humanization? How do we create a sense of solidarity with a group as opposed to with an individual? How we foster trust and permit it to develop? How we embed and understand people's own understanding of fairness and also teach fairness and what counts as fair behavior towards others within a system? Norms play an enormously important role, and they play a role that's somewhere between intrinsic motivations, the things that come from within, and extrinsic through social control, because to some extent they're self-chosen and internalized, what's sometimes called integrated regulation in some social psychology, the sense of doing what's right. But to some extent it's also conformism and just basically knowing what others are doing. There's one site, for example, that I've been studying with my students that's about voluntary donations in music, puts music up online under Creative Commons. Anybody can copy it legally and share it. And yet that we have 5 years of data, 75,000 transactions, and people are paying on average $8, even though they could legally pay nothing and could minimally download for $5. What they do is they set simple markers, among other things. What they set simple markers that say, here's the normal contribution, 8. And it turns out half the people try to just be normal. Only 15% do the minimum. A little bit more try to be what's marked as generous, very generous, we love you. Giving people focal points for what counts as appropriate behavior turns out to really matter in simply drawing people in to act in that way. Another major and important phenomenon is the phenomenon, I was talking about extrinsic motivation, the use of punishment and reward, but more importantly of transparency and of reputation, building into systems the capacity for people to watch each other and know that they are watching each other and being watched. But we also have the problem of crowding out, of the possibility that when you put in too many controls from the outside, you remove the internal controls and you essentially undermine what you're trying to do. One way of looking at this is to think of us as being the product of motivational vectors. Material interests, for sure, that used to be all of the explanation, but also moral commitments, emotional needs and responses, and social motivations of connections, some of which are functional. I need to know you because you're going to help me get a job. And some of which are identity. That is to say, I see myself as part of you. This is how I understand myself. And each of these essentially, and it turns out there's a good bit of literature in psychology, in economics, that tries to map specifically when a particular intervention that increases material interests will actually make an act say, you know what? Now that I know that I can do this, so blood donations is a classic old example. Once you introduce payment for blood donation, you reduce the quality of the signal for people saying, I'm a generous person. They'll go and try to act for themselves a generous person in some other domain rather than in payment. There's actually a nice new study from Sweden that shows this effect very, very powerfully. We can't burden people too much with cooperation. We need rooms for leadership and asymmetric contribution. We need it to be relatively fluid for exit and entry. If people are interested in any of these later, I'm happy to talk about it. I want to make sure we get to a conversation. Basically, the building blocks are communication, who matters, the I, the thou, the we, and the them, the question of what's right, what's fair, and what's normal, the calculation, both the material interest and the social relational and allowing people to connect, and the social dynamics of trust and transparency, of reputation, of building social networks, of leadership, and of the ability for some people to give more. As I said, some people can be more generous and others less. Some people in Wikipedia spend a huge amount of time, others less. You can't really do it without the other. And you build, and I won't go obviously into all of the design levers, but you can see in each of these systems, as you look in the field, how these are built in these systems to allow people to actually pursue these goals. More important for this purpose, just to set it and end there, is the need to be able to read all of these different disciplines, to extract from them feasible targets that you can then say, here's the way in which I think this particular design element, in this particular case, the fact that I allow people to discuss gives them the ability to move away. So you start out with a, this is so idiotic, I'll change. And somebody suddenly writes, my favorite here is, why in text do you write, What you're doing is you're saying, I'm a human too, listen to me. And creating that platform that gives people the affordance to communicate in this very human form is incredibly important to begin to, and as you follow the discussion, walk down from the conflict and actually reach a sense of consensus. Similarly, humanization, people being able to put up themselves, why it is that we fly for great distances to talk with each other and see each other face to face because we need to humanize, and then to think as you design about how you do these things. The difference between litigation, etc. Anyway, let me end with just a minute and a half roughly on music. So one way of using the web to deal with music distribution is the way that Prince seems to use it, which is looking for the web for any instances of the music that are there and then suing. It's a system of using the web to capture, observe, and try to control. A very different alternative, this is part of the music case study that I have been looking at, is the effort to build a system that no longer makes the fans at arm's length just passive recipients, but brings them into the conversation. So what is it that you build in here? First of all, there's a style. There's a, here, you can use this. It's under Creative Commons. You're allowed to use it. I actually enjoy the fact that people mix my stuff. It's part of ours together. But I'm also selling. I need to make a living. It becomes part of the relationship that you contribute to my being able to make a living. I half joke and half create norms, right? You already stole it? Fine. But really the norm is that we are in this together and I need to make a living out of this. Why don't you pay for a banana instead of for the song so that you can connect to it? Now, I'm not going to set up my shows, but I'm going to create a site that allows you to come together and say, here's 20 of us, 30 of us, 40 of us in this town in this evening. Come perform here. Building a network using this particular technical system. Now, notice again, the institutional system is open, loosely coupled, do whatever you want. The technical system is open, use the music as you want, communicate around it. The norms are very much speak with each other and speak with me, and let's build this together. And then there's stuff from you. So let me just end with, let's see if this will...
It works out really well, you know. Anyway, so I wrote this song about my experiences as a software designer. This is called Coding.
Apparently not. Sorry. Oh, well. The critical thing that, not the critical, the thing that I would have liked to show you here, if it turns out, and if not, I will, is a variety of how he basically brings together his fans with his music. They're mashing up a variety of things using all sorts of other open platforms that they're creating videos on top of his music, which are part of his story. And then bridging the divide between the online and the real world, we have this closing moment.
In her dorm room, is that correct? Yeah, wearing in her apartment. Yeah, wearing this T-shirt.
So thank you.
So thank you for that very interesting lecture and sort of introduction into the world of networking. I'll speak today about, I'll hope to talk about historical development within design that sort of takes us to hopefully the time that you're actually talking about, and maybe tying it in a little bit out of a design angle. Let's see how it goes, and let's see how we sort of interplay these two speeches together. So I'm really going to talk about the designers and the designer role and how that has changed through time up until getting to where we are today. Doing that, I'll also show you a lot of Scandinavian examples of what has happened through time, maybe also because I think it's usually easier to see mistakes and different approaches from other people than doing it yourself. But I think we've had a similar development in most parts of the world, but this way you can give it an external view. But I think for many people, the classical way to view design is this. It's a beautiful object, isn't it? But it's just that. It's the Chanterelle vase designed by Tapio Virkala, a Finnish designer. It was, in the 1950s, design was a way to put nationalities on the map, to somehow emphasize a national idea of design and the beauty in objects. And they were also pretty much identified through the designer themselves. The designers were created to be this sort of weird and artistic types that somehow created this beautiful thing. I think Tapio Virkala is a good example in that sense, because he was a very well-educated man, very subtle in many ways, but when they actually showed that object in the World Expositions in Milan, where it got a lot of prizes, they on purpose, they made him into this designery type, which was slightly weird. And although he did know to speak different languages, when they had the press release event, he actually stood perfectly quiet. And they marketed him as the uomo naturale, so the man out of the woods, if you like. So he stood perfectly quiet, and when the press came, he they had these on the grand piano, they had a plate with small stones, pebbles. Apparently he ate them every now and then, and that was the only thing he did, to be this eccentric designer. So they created this myth of the designer as the sole creator of the beautiful object, who came directly from the woods and created something out of it. And I think this way of thinking of design can still be used today. Many companies do it, where the designer name somehow is the thing behind a beautiful object. So it hasn't disappeared anywhere, but I think the design has developed quite a lot since those days, and a lot of things have happened. Even with the same guy, Virkala, the next decade, in the 1960s, what happened was the designers actually started working together with engineering people and marketing people in a team. And this is what the same guy did. It's a Finnish ketchup bottle and some electric fuse, or sort of electric sort of detailing. So you can see that the products are very, very different from what they were previously. It's not something that you would put up in a display. It's actually something that's part of life in general. And the role of the designer would then be to be part of a team with these people in product development, rather than this weird and wonderful creator of something that just happened to happen like magic. So quite a mind shift in the way of working, I think. Partly it was still sort of in between, I think. This was the time when in Finland, for example, there was actually founded a proper education for industrial design for people working within industry. But I just love this picture because that's actually a guy called Jussi Ahola, who was one of the first ones who graduated. He just created this whole range of stoves where you can be pretty sure that he hasn't done it alone. It's done together with these engineers and marketing people, and still they sort of market it with the designer, but he's already sort of getting towards the background and he's slightly blurred out, so it's not sort of, and he doesn't look like, he's almost in a business gear rather than being a man out of the woods. So you can see a transformation happening there in the role of the designer. But what was really, I think, different to the first picture was that much of the design was actually done completely anonymously within the production teams of these products. Whether they're beautiful or not, I think we can have many arguments of them. But clearly, the design work was really sort of just part of a team, and not even, for historians afterwards, you can't even say who has been the designer. You know that there are people who were trained as designers in these teams, but who they actually were in which particular product is already difficult to judge. I think this way of working with design, where it's actually part of the product development process, is still very common, and it's also a very valid way to work with it. I think this is a good example of the same company that just did the tractor in the previous slide. They also did paper machines, and this is 4 decades of paper machines coming out of the same company. The company itself has changed names, I think, more times than they've changed designers. But still, you can see that there's still, the latest one is fairly new. That's actually 70s, 80s, turn of the 90s, and then the millennium in the design development. But clearly, they're still there as a design team together with the mechanical and the marketing people. But what happened after the 60s was that the designers somehow, they wanted more than just being part of a product development group. And that largely came through the notion of understanding the human, of wanting to define also what should be designed, and not only participating in the design process itself and the product development process. In the Nordic countries, that came very strongly through the arrival of ergonomics. So I just think this is quite slightly funny, because this is actually, it's a school newspaper, slightly like Parsons. It's from what today is the university, or the Aalto University of Art and Design. It's how the industrial designers wanted to present themselves. They actually, in Finnish, they say the technocrats are coming. But you can see their sort of love of this ergonomic approach of knowing what the human being is, of understanding every physical measurement of them, of being the ones who understand how far you can place something so that it's reachable, of understanding all of that so that they can really be, the designers wanted to be the ones who understand the human being in that whole set of the process. In the 1970s, we all know the economics were slightly sour. We had the oil crisis, all of that. But much of this user understanding was also very, very topical through the fact that designers understood that people come in all sorts. So it wasn't only designing for the wealthy or the rich or the ones who were medium-sized. There was also a strong understanding of children, elderly, disabled people. All of these special groups got, I think, the first attention during that time. In Helsinki, the underground, the metro, was a big social project where designers really came in mass and wanted to understand how people want to move and what they want to do. And I think the topic itself was also very somehow typical to the era, that it was a social good, somehow a moral good, rather than designing private cars or even tractors might have been less popular at the time. But this way of looking at design, or designers looking at themselves as being the ones who understand users, of course, has not disappeared anywhere. I think it grew slowly also into a completely different area of design, where we started talking about user interfaces, where previously, when they did the tractor in the 70s, you could pretty much have a lever where it said stop and you know, go. You could type it or paint it on the physical product. When the whole era of electronics came, we suddenly had more and more information which had to be put into a smaller and smaller space, usually of a display, and the whole design of that logic became, I think, part of what many designers do today. So in that sense, the user approach definitely has not disappeared. And that, of course, is something that's always done with even more specialists involved. But times changed. In the 1980s, it was very far from being socially aware. It was time of a very, how would I say, right-wing thinking. It was the rise of design and sort of design management, as it was called at that time. The London Business School, I think, was the first one to really lift the whole idea, at least out of our sort of European thinking. It started, of course, like you know, with yes, you should have, at least you should have your stationery have the same logo as your you know, that was the simplistic way of thinking of it. But also out of design point of view, it was really that design suddenly saw themselves as a coordinator, wanting that everything that comes out of a company somehow represents the same thinking, the same thought. And so hence design became the coordinating point between all these different aspects of it. I think it also coincided quite heavily with because of the economic situation in the 80s, a lot of companies went together. So we actually had many companies where previously it had been several. So the coordinating function of design was also very timely. And that sort of design managerial aspect, of course, is definitely very strongly there. I think the Finnish example, Fiskars, is a very, very good one on that, where if you look at the scissors from the 60s and the pruner from only a couple of years back, you can see that it's the whole roadmap of products is very well coordinated. So somehow the designers saw themselves as the knot point of the company. They didn't quite dare to say that they're leading it, but they said that without us, the unity of it all crashes. We're the bonds that bring all the aspects of it together and talk about with all the parts of the company. But you can probably guess what's happened then. The designers wanted more, not only to be the ones coordinating the whole roadmap before they did the definition of what the product should be, and then did the product development, and then did the aesthetics of it. They actually wanted to be there to talk about the brand. The brand became the big thing in the 1990s. And that also brought the concept of, at that time we called it total experience design. So instead of just talking about products, the rhetorics was to talk about the services, the retail solution, the whole process between the first idea to the last way where you meet the products and the service in the market. So the designers actually didn't want to look at just a particular product or a particular service, but at the entity of it all. I think this is a picture from Nokia of the time, where you can already see that it's sort of, they're trying to show the experience of the usage situation rather than the product itself. You can barely see the product; it's just been put away, sort of. So that sort of thinking quite strongly. And part of the brand building was also the understanding of lifestyles. So now we didn't talk about people as their dimensions anymore. We talked about what do they feel like, how do they think about things, and that also brought designers a whole new set of tools. I mean, we started thinking about scenarios, about mood sort of mapping, about different types of ways of expressing sort of human feeling more than just physical aspects of it. I don't know if you recognize that. I think it looks like many of you sort of, oh yeah, I've been there. I've been gluing those people and places pictures together and try to show that what a product does. But that was really what came in the 1990s. And then, so part of the brand building was really it was also strategic thinking, and that's, I think, where the design management discussion really moved into the field of wanting to be strategic and not only managerial, but thinking on a more strategic level. Of course, it still meant the designers wanted to be there the entire way, from the strategic thinking to the road mapping to the, all the steps, so they hadn't lost any of the bits, but they were just expanding of the way of thinking. You can probably guess that by the time we reached the millennium, design again was something completely different. And this was the time, at least for the Nordic countries, where design was very heavily linked into national innovation. Innovation programs was everything. Everyone needed to innovate. We needed to be creative because we had to compete against China syndromes, or we had to be renewal of the businesses, and all of that was very, very much it. So I think a good example, that the two top ones in Finland was really when they linked the design policy to the national innovation policy. So the idea was that you needed design to sort of regenerate thinking and come out with new stuff. I think the lower ones are pictures of when there was a design year in Finland in 2005. The rhetorics then was that if design is good, you live a happy life. If you're miserable, it's just badly designed. So somehow there was this sort of thinking of it's part of the vision work, but it's also part of everything we do. Might sound slightly sort of grandiose, doesn't it? But it was also sort of, I think it was grandiose and small at the same time. It was also looking at a very everyday things in that sense. So it was just a new approach that that you can't really, unless you use design, you're dead thinking. And that also, of course, moved the design discussions very much from being a cultural issue to the economic or the sort of even political sphere. It really was a way to sort of make a stance, I think, and that was I think for the design community at least it was a new place to be. It somehow increased the importance of what design was, and it was really part of I'd say vision work before we get to the point of strategy and so on. But now, of course, the interesting question comes: what happens then? Where are we now? And this is really, I think, where me as a historian has to sort of step back a little bit, because I can't really make proper judgments on things so close. But I think we can have some hunches and we can have guesses, but that would more be the designer in me probing and trying to guess where we're at. But clearly, I think the diffusion of what we're doing is really continuing. It's not becoming any more straightforward and closer to the, this is a simple thing, this is what we do. On the contrary, the whole thing is actually blowing out even more. So what has been happening lately is really that as we have these networks and as the whole the people we work with is even broader, it's really been, design has been a way to put in creativity in processes which are already there, that have been there for a long time. I think a good example, this one up here is, I don't know if you do them here, but it's when you have a big house of a building, a block of houses where you have to change the entire piping of them. Typically, you have to do it like every 30 years or so. You take out all the piping and redo all of it. And it's usually a huge hassle for the people who live there, because typically it's one company who actually delivers the toilets or the loos and the sort of sanitary stuff. There's another construction company that does much of the construction work. There's a lot of people in the process. And worst case scenario, you might need to move out from your flat for half a year or something. So what they've been doing now in Finland is really funded by the government and the state, is to start thinking about this. Maybe we could do it more user-friendly. Maybe we can actually rethink the whole way we work, but out of the user and the individual perspective. And then they take in design to rethink the whole way of looking at the problem, and not looking at it as a sort of combined effort from the guy who delivers the toilet and the guy who installs it, but actually looking at it from the perspective of the person who lives in that flat. And this is actually the process they've created on how you can do it so that it's as pleasurable as possible for the person who's there. So you might not think the design is something that you do when you design a process for repairing plumbing, but in today's world, it actually can be that. And sometimes it also appears in places where you wouldn't really expect it. This is a piece of study where it's called VTT. It's the State Research Agency, which is the place where you get many super experts. They're people who they have like triple doctorates, I don't know. They're this good at a field that's this narrow. And they've been accused lately of maybe not always being so relevant, coming back to what you were talking about. And in order to actually get them to function in this world of networking, what they've been doing is they've been taking in designers to make them rethink the way they think. And I think that's a new way of looking at design, is really to take in this particular exercise, they're actually using the experts to create mock-ups of why their research might be relevant in the future. And I think that's a new way, if we can, as designers, look at how we can make other people more relevant in this world, then we're already quite far. But of course, the big question is, what will happen next? And I think the big approach, which ties what you were saying together, is really that today we are facing completely new problems. It's a completely new world. And I think that's why this sort of Rittel approach of wicked problems and designers solving them somehow is so timely. It's really where, by asking the right questions, we're already halfway there. And I think that's something that we need to come together, all of us, to be able to even start answering the questions. But I hope that the designers can be the creative sparkle in that soup, the ones who sort of somehow dare to ask even the uncomfortable questions, and to get all of that going in order to make a better world with time. But I hope that sort of gives us a good starting point to the discussion and ties us in together.
That was fantastic. Thank you. I was scribbling away madly, so hopefully I'll have some good questions to ask you guys. So one thing I was struck by in both of your conversations is that you use the word innovation, which seems to be the word of the day. We're always talking about innovation. And Joha, you made a very interesting statement that we're talking about integrated, not interdisciplinary. And what that led me to think about, Anna, related to your talk just then, is the notion of interoperability. And I wondered if you could both talk about that notion and why that may be important as we begin to think about innovation in the context of design and business.
Integrated, interoperable, many concepts. Obviously, from the perspective of somebody who looks at networks and network design as opposed to real physical world, interoperability, which is to say the ability of different systems and different components, be they appliances, applications, network components, to talk to each other in the functionally necessary level so that they can actually deliver whatever combined output they need, is absolutely critical. In the sense that, again, if the idea of the network is innovation can happen anywhere, creativity can happen anywhere, socialization can happen anywhere, if each component, be it the technical or the organizational, can develop on its own as fast as it can if it's about innovation, as openly or participatory as it can if it's about participatory culture. But you also want to connect it to everyone else, and these others are using other devices, other components of the system. Then having these minimal interfaces of interoperability that allow things to really develop in one domain, but then be easily visible and conversable with another is absolutely critical. So the core idea of the internet, just as a matter of engineering design, is precisely a very, very thin and minimal TCP/IP algorithm that everybody who's designing anything to use it, all they need to know is how to translate it into this one common language, and then it transmits across. So this basic idea that you accept that different systems develop differently for different purposes and are optimized in different ways for their own things, that it's critical that they talk to each other, and therefore that it always needs to be designed so that that there's some way in which systems that are completely alien to each other can still converse, cuts across all of these, and it talks about communications networks, it talks about organizational networks and the ability to actually get suppliers together with buyers in a context where the relevant interoperability is the fact that they see each other face to face and have lunch. And see the human that's the connection between them as the way in which I'm in this company and that. So absolutely central.
I think the concept of innovation has also changed, only even over the past 10 years. Originally, I think it was very much a top-down concept. It was sort of, yes, now we need to innovate, something, the big thing needs to innovate. Whereas now it's very much sort of bottom-up as well. So it's dispersed, just as Dee said, but it's also very much almost uncontrolled in that sense. There's sort of you get together, just like you said, there's a good idea somewhere and that becomes an innovation, and then hopefully you can support it in different ways so that it actually becomes something more than just sort of a tiny thing. But it's sort of a very different notion to this original idea of innovation, where it was sort of a big national or organizational sort of command to think new, which didn't really get us that far.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys 3 C words that all relate, and let's talk about them. So one theme that came up in both of your talks was the notion of coordination and coordinated action, and the kinds of design levers that either give rise to such thing or create barriers to that. And so 2 other words came up for me. One is the notion of consensus, and then a kind of counterbalance to that in terms of conflict. And so I'm interested if you guys could talk a little bit about the role of consensus and or conflict in the context of the idea of coordination of action, or of means, or of people.
That's a big concept, and I suppose it depends very much on where you're looking at it. I think with the design, it's always very relevant to the whole context of it. I mean, I think if we are looking at big global issues, it's a joint effort, and I think there you don't really need that much. It's more than coordination. It's really getting people together, and in that sense, sort of collaboration rather than coordination. Whereas again, if you're looking at, say, an enterprise, it's still, it does have a meaning to try to do something rather than to try and do everything, because you usually end up doing everything slightly worse than you would do. You know, doing something good is better than doing everything in a mediocre way. So I think in that sense, it's out of a design perspective, it's very much dependent on in which realm you work. Where, what is it that you try to achieve? And even if you talk about the big issues, I still think that it's, for the individual and the smaller groups, it is better to actually have a idea, a small idea, but something that gathers people together, and then you just run with that one. Then if many people have sort of ideas that sort of work towards the same goal, then that usually brings it further. But to try and coordinate it's a tricky one if you talk about larger groups. So there I think the collaboration aspect is usually the more beneficial in the long run.
So I think, sorry.
Doesn't matter.
I think that when you bring different people together, when you understand that bringing different people together is the critical component to what it is that you desire. And again, the desire might be different perspectives being brought to bear. If we're talking about democratic participation, it might be different ideas about creativity being brought together. If we're talking about innovation, if people will genuinely express their experience, their wisdom, their perspective, there will be lack of fit with others. So conflict, in that sense at least, is inevitable. John Seeley Brown and John Hagel have this beautiful concept of creative friction, and organizations that allow people from different perspectives to come together and basically rub their various differences against each other. To some extent seeking consensus, to some extent seeking accommodation, to try to fit these things together. And I think one of the critical features of the kinds of systems, particularly online, that we see that really have distributed innovation, be they free and open source software development, be they Wikipedia, be they collaborative news sites, is that they have very different mechanisms for conflict resolution. And one of the fascinating things about Wikipedia, for example, is the degree to which consensus is a target. And in order to reach it, what you get is these long conversations, sometimes going on for pages and pages in the talk pages, with people using at one level norms to not shut each other up, but still keep each other within the bounds of what counts as acceptable conflict. So you see in the media, in various news reports that are skeptical of Wikipedia, you'll hear only about the context where things broke down to a point where you have to shut things down, because that's sexy. The vast majority of instances is one where people, they'll go another round, they'll go another round. This is not about trivial things. I've done one study of debates over creationism, which is not a trivial issue for people. Still, setting a set of common goals, going one more round and another round, trying to eventually get to the point where through this friction and accepted and acknowledged difference and conflict, you come with something that at least those who are participating see as better than what it was. So I actually think that both, on one hand, openness sufficient to allow sufficiently individual creation to create the conflict, and on the other hand, if not consensus, at least a commitment to working through and accommodating is absolutely central to, on one hand, allowing this creativity, and on the other hand, allowing it to come to some effective outcome.
I think this sort of creative friction is also understood that it's needed in order to push any area forward. And I think that's also largely what we're talking about here, is really that if you talk about design as an area, it can't really develop itself alone. It's really a lot more efficiently developed when it's done with people who actually come from other fields, usually quite close by, but like social sciences or the humanities or other areas, because that sort of friction usually pushes the whole thinking, the design thinking, further than if you would sit in a group with like-minded. So although it sometimes feels slightly uncomfortable, I think it's really what drives the development, is that slight friction.
So Anna, you mentioned the concept of wicked problems. So, and I'm going to start with you because I know you have to leave pretty soon. What is a wicked problem that you personally feel like it's important for us to solve? At some point, it can be 5 years out, 10 years out, but what is one that you're interested in working on that you believe a kind of approach to transdisciplinary design, to a kind of diversity of minds being brought together, that it's important that we begin to look at, or we may have been looking at it, but in perhaps in new ways?
So how do I say this without sounding completely naive? I'll just say it and we'll see. It's the question of how we reintegrate concepts of virtue and morality into practice. That is to say, I think we've gone through a very long period where we've seen, maybe there's weird altruism, maybe we can come up with all sorts of weird psychological explanations, maybe we can go down to mapping the neurons exactly that will explain why we're altruistic because it gives us a certain kind of kick. And this I'm amazed, every time I try to talk to people working in cognitive psychology or developmental psychology today, we don't really have a good model for how over time we developed into different societies and people with different attitudes. Why is it that when New York City loses the electricity in 1977, it looks the way that it looked? And then when it loses it again in 2003, or was it 2004, it looks completely differently. And what is it that happened there? Is it just magic? Presumably not. There is some set of social processes that have to do with how we set our organizations together, how we built our environment, how we build our social institutions, that changed who we are when we looked at each other, not as a threat, but as a, have you heard anything? It's a completely different feel in the city streets. That, to me, is a wicked problem, that at the moment we're, as I said, I almost had to start and say, I know this will sound naive, but asking the question is almost silly. I'd be thrilled, and that's a chunk of what I'm working on. I'd be thrilled to see other people keep working on it without being embarrassed about it.
Sure, absolutely. Great. And Anna, what about you?
I think I would probably start with the more practical wicked problems, or somehow the more mundane ones, or maybe because that's the ones where there has been at least more work done so far. I think the classical one is sustainability, that we all know, that's sort of the one that's in the air. But there's also quite sort of smaller ones, if you can have a small wicked problem. I don't know if that's a sort of oxymoron in itself. But things like healthcare, where the entire system is built out of fractions and pieces, and no one really has control of it, where now with design thinking, we're really going into, again, from the patient's approach. What makes it more pleasurable? No one thinks that healthcare at the moment is a pleasure. No one thinks that it even, I mean, if we say that it works, we're probably naive. But still, I think there we could do a lot of things. And there are many questions like that which are very everyday, but somehow they've become such big networks of issues that no one really wants to touch them. So I think we could find many of those very, very mundane issues, but somehow where we could lose the politics, we could lose the sort of all the different, the doctors and the nurses and the machine producers and everyone who does their own tiny little sort of piece of the puzzle, and rather look at it from a more holistic and sort of human approach and achieve something, I hope.
Okay. How are we doing? Do you have to whisk? All right.
Thanks so much.
They're going to continue.
So one thing that did strike me about, again, both of the presentations is I felt a particularly human perspective that you both were putting on the topic. And I just wondered, as a historian, if you've seen trends back and forth historically about kind of human approach to design versus a more formal approach back to human, and sort of where you think we are in the cycle, and how that might begin to change going forward.
Yeah, I think it's been also largely, and this is actually quite funny because I sit almost with my back towards you when I look at you.
Okay.
But it's been a development of how we view the human. So like I said, we started out by understanding the physical sort of measurements of humans, and then our understanding has gradually grown from there to understanding what makes people tick. What do they dream about? What do they aspire to? And I think that whole approach makes it quite different than if you talk about, can I reach to that knob? So I think the understanding of the human is also changing very much. I think maybe the latest development is really understanding the whole sort of social implication of humans, rather how do they, like he was talking about, how do they act in a network? What sort of makes us not tick alone, but tick together? And I think if we can get to the bottom of that, we're already doing quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah, good.
There's a mic over here on the right. Do we have any questions? You must have questions.
Everything can't be that simple and straightforward.
Don't you want to ask Anna about the future? Yeah. Oh, I think you need it for the recording purposes. Thank you.
So,
Do you want to start?
first, thank you for this fantastic set of presentations. It's a lot to think about, especially with this introduction of this thing called transdisciplinary design. And so the question I'm asking comes from the point of view of architecture. And it has to do with the question of expertise and its relationship to design, because it seems like what you were trying to show over the course of the sequence was how the idea of expertise was either kind of constructed or propagated or kind of challenged. And so I guess the first part of the question would be if you could just kind of comment on the role of expertise and what's motivating these shifts in design. And then the second one was more of also a question, because with this emergence of transdisciplinary design, it seems like there's also a danger maybe, or a tendency to mystify design as a kind of thing that your phrase was the creative sparkle. And so I wonder if we're kind of going back to what you started with, where you had this man coming out of the forest, instead these designers coming in as the kind of socializers for these experts. Is that also kind of like the same thing, in a way, mystifying the designer as this thing that no one really knows what he or she's doing? So not a very totally precisely formed question, but hopefully I can hear your thoughts.
I'll start with the first one. And I think, I mean, this I might view from the point of education, from how do designers find themselves as designers and what makes them designers. And I think what's been happening lately, which is a very good development, is really that design is so many things that sometimes I think that, at least in my case, students usually, they burn for something, and they usually find these odd combinations, which at first glimpse might seem that, why would you put these, topics together? But what turns out to be actually a unique combination of knowledge once you're out of school, and that has actually made that particular person a specialist in an area where no one else is. So when you put them together with other people, they actually have something that they bring something to the table that not everyone does. And I think that's a development that I cherish. We've sort of come out of the era of training masses of people with the same approach to actually hopefully giving people wings to find themselves and to find a good niche which is interesting for that individual, and hence gives a bigger piece to the puzzle. But as for demystifying or mystifying design, I actually think it's sort of avoided by the fact that design is more everyday and common now. Design is actually more known to more people. It's not something that it becomes an area of knowledge as any other. I mean, you can mystify economics if you want to. You can really take it into the level of we know, don't try to. I think you can do that with many areas. So I think it's more, I can't see much of the risk of mystifying it when it becomes so part of what, many organizations and many people do. I think the mystification process was more when it was more rare. It was sort of a unique phenomenon on its own. It was somehow sort of, look, this is it, that you can't really understand. At least in the Nordic countries today, design is everywhere. So
why do we have a discipline called design then? I think that's what I'm curious about. Why do we even bother?
Well, why do we have a discipline called economics?
Because there's expertise to it.
Well, there's an expertise to design.
So what is it? I mean, it's a wicked question. It's not fair.
But I clearly see that there is an expertise in design. I mean, it is really, we have a very, I think, defined design process, a way to reach from the problem to an end result, to think about things creatively, and all of that. So I don't think that's, but I was just trying to say that it's becoming a professional expertise as any other. So that sort of takes out the mystification of it. It increases the importance of it, but it's, to me at least, it's not very mystified at the moment. It's very much part of our everyday bread and butter.
I don't want to monopolize, but just as one last follow-up. The reason I was asking, because one of the things that often is coming up in design schools is how to find money, basically. And so you have to propose projects, and you want to propose experiments and research, and often it's in this kind of scientific mode. And so what you're asked for is to deliver, well, deliverables. What are the kind of markers that you can measure your design by, your experiments by? And so with science, it's easier because there's an expertise involved, like economics. You can say, well, here's the experiment, here's what we're doing, here's what we'll get. But with design, you can say, well, we're going to go look at some stuff, and then we're going to design some stuff, and then we're going to get some money for that, you know?
Yeah, but that's maybe also part of the fact that it's a young profession, because I think there the development and the definition of what our methods are is part of what we're actually doing at the moment. So it's not only being a good professional, you also have to somehow formalize the way you think and make it sort of understandable to other people, more than just making the end result understandable to other people. And I think that's really a shift in what we are at the moment. So it's really putting the thumb on what is happening at the moment.
Yogi asked me to sit in his seat. I'm going to intone in a deep voice and pretend to have the magisterial knowledge that he has, just so that we could continue more conversation. So, but you handled that one so perfectly. Be quiet. But please, other questions. To the mic, please. If you can. Over there. Yeah, please.
This is not the musical chairs, it's actually the chair stays, but the people walk.
So how do you get a microphone to the other end of the room without actually having to carry it? There's a wicked problem. My question, and this, perhaps how do you make this less awkward, is another good problem. But given all these questions, big and small, and public and private, that design is, we all understand it, or none of us understand it. The wicked problem specifically has this question of responsibility. And so, Anna and Yokai, how would you respond to that? And do you actually think that actually that's been maintained? Because wicked problems are discussed often, but responsibility rarely ever is. And we have that Toyota, I wish he was still here, because Toyota is a great example at the moment, given their question about design and whether it was actually the problem. For anybody who doesn't know, Toyota blamed the questioning of design, not the design, for their problems in braking and acceleration recently. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. We actually had a very good discussion on part of this yesterday with some people here where we were talking about why it is that the moral consequences of what we do in design always seem to arise when the economy goes sour. I don't know, but that's another paper. I can give you the link to it. But for some reason, in most professions, you would, when the economy is good, you could question what you do, the people who hire you, and so on. But when the economy is bad, you would really try to keep your job and be, stay under the radar and so on. For some reason, in design, it seems to be the opposite. Every time the economic times are hard, we somehow get more moral, and moral questions arise, and ethical standpoints become more important. So we saw it in the 60s and 70s with the oil crisis and all of that. The designers were actually questioning the same people who hired them. They were really pushing the industry, and we had Victor Papanek, we had all of that discussion very heavily there. We could see some of it in the early 90s with some of that economic backturn, and we can clearly see it now. I mean, try to show me the designer who doesn't talk about sustainability at the moment. So somehow it's also, I know it's ugly to say it's fashionable, but it's somehow it's in the substance of the air to designers that when we're not doing that well, we start questioning the world around us. And I don't know what really causes it.
So just one addendum. So the wicked problem, though, explicitly states that the person who creates a solution must also take responsibility for the problems they cause.
Yeah.
And in these periods of time, success or failure, we've created plenty of problems. And so Do you think that's a valid expectation of designers?
I think it's very timely that designers are asking themselves the question now.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
I actually come from a 15-year career in development work, international development work, and I left that career because of design methodology. And I want to speak a bit to this expertise and have your thoughts on this new movement of social design. It's something that interests me. I'm looking into it, the application of design methodologies in United Nations type of work, and I just wanted your view as a historian on where this may be going. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that would be a beautiful example of the, or similar in the vein of the ones that I was showing in the end, where you can really take design into areas which we wouldn't typically have seen it in, but actually through design thinking create something that comes out of those areas. So that was what I was trying to show, that today we have many designers who actually take in creativity and a design thinking mode into processes and places which have been there for a long time. But somehow by stirring things up a little bit and thinking about them from a designery perspective, we actually get more out of it than you would before. So the place or the context or the organization as such might not be new, like the United Nations, but by design thinking, you can actually create more than you could without. So it actually fits beautifully well in what's really sort of occupying many or most of the designers at the moment.
I just want to build on just quickly. I was just thinking about the challenge in Haiti related to the distortion of networks and design thinking, is that in that situation there was a complete breakdown of the network, like an absolute loss of all infrastructure. And I think we saw for a little while the limits of design when there is no infrastructure in which that thinking can take root and infuse itself. And it's an interesting problem to begin to think about the relative relationship between design and design thinking and the needs for certain kinds of context in which it can thrive.
Totally, yeah. And I think it was also a good example on once it actually started to work again. The first starting points were really back to the classical design. There were products that actually helped the everyday life, like you can get fire, you can cook on them, you know, you can get to the very basics. So then that sort of critical situation somehow takes the design thinking or backwards, or sort of to the starting point again, where the first point is at least to get functioning products so that you can cook your meal or build a hospital, and then slowly once you get the network and the infrastructure back, then you can start doing more of the social networking and all of that. So it's an interesting thought, where you also sort of, when you strip away society, you somehow strip away the possibilities to work as well.
Other questions?
I'm interested in this relationship between the makers of useful things. I'm interested in this relationship between the makers of useful things and the word to design. And when did we separate design from making? And what is the derivation of the actual word design?
I think I don't know, you might have a better answer to it, but I think the classical way to view it was that it happened really with the industrialization of the late 18th century, where it was really, before that we had craft, where the same person actually designed, produced, and did the product, where with the arrival of industrialization it sort of separated the two of them. We had someone who designed the product and then a machinery to produce it, and different people who actually made the product. And I think that's most likely the starting point of that division. Funnily enough, it's actually coming together a full circle again, because today we're having a very broad network of crafters, of craft people. And I think many of the design people are also actually doing craft, at least, you know, part-time or on their free time, or in a network or in a social somehow connection somewhere. So it seems like there would be something in the human nature of at least designers to also want to do something themselves. I don't know, you probably have a better answer to that, but it seems like a full circle.
For instance, in this program, Transdisciplinary Design, will there be design studio, which will be really a workshop for actually building these systems, whether it's on the system level or on this, handheld scale.
That's a good question.
Is there a studio component to this, or is it?
I may have to answer that one, or be accountable for that one. I think that it's a great question, and it goes back to also to the question of expertise, and are we developing a new expertise, or are we abandoning expertise, for example, in form making, or in sort of something between kind of engineering and poetics. And I think that there will always be kind of a part of the spectrum of design that will continue to make chairs and fridges and all the things that Anna showed that have been part of the history of design. What's interesting to me, at least, in the creation of this transdisciplinary program is that there are also other things we might make, and make in a very expansive notion that may be material. They may be combinations of materiality with electronics with software. They may even go as far as many of my colleagues here at Parsons do, designing services, things that are fairly immaterial, systems, and even potentially kind of prompts for behavior. And what's really interesting to me is that it goes back to this question of expertise, is how do you then construct an educational environment around the idea that these outcomes are very sort of multivariate. They go all over the place. And can you begin to develop certain competencies? And I think they exist. And within design education, within the establishment of this program, we try to nail some of those things down. So prototyping becomes a very nice word to use because you can prototype objects, but you can also prototype social scenarios, for example. So prototyping becomes important. As everyone talks about, collaboration becomes suddenly not something you do, but actually as a kind of after effect of design, but actually becomes a core skill. How do you collaborate? How do you understand collaboration? When do you know whether to collaborate with one person, 5 people, 10 people, an industry, or to crowdsource something? And so collaboration can become a form of expertise itself, a kind of method for working. And what's interesting to me is that design has operated very effectively through some very sort of narrow or tightly described set of skills. And they've been wonderful to produce buildings and products and communication pieces and all those kinds of things. But if we want to take on a different set of problems, then we have to develop a different set of tools and outcomes. And so within the program itself, I think there will be one of the things that really interests me profoundly is to think about what it means to design a beautiful experience. Can we bring aesthetics back into these immaterial kinds of things? Can we have a vocabulary for that? A beautiful description. Those are hard things to then think about, but that's where I think we need to be, is to think not only design as a kind of operational way of problem solving, but also then to re-inject that sparkle so that it's not just, okay, problem solved, but it's, okay, I'd actually prefer to live that way, even if it's with less, because it's more exciting to me than the way I live now. And design has that opportunity. And it is, to go back, I'm trying to sort of weave all the questions, it is ultimately a really tough thing, I find, about sort of, do designers have something special or not? Is there a little magic? I infuriated my colleagues years ago with a presentation at this event where I talked about the black box of design, or the magic box of design. And I don't know, and saying that, somehow some people are good at it and some people are not as good at it. Somehow Apple creates the iPod, but Microsoft, throwing 10 times the resources, creates the Zune. And what is it? Is it the system, is it the structure, or is there something in the water? And I think there is a kind of indescribable thing, but we don't need to mystify it. I mean, some people are stronger than other people. Some people remember things better than other people, and some people come up with ideas better than other people. I don't think it has to be something highly mystified. But I do think there are, and when you hear some of the projects that Anna's been involved with, the redesign of a university, that's a really interesting problem, and it doesn't require architecture alone. it requires something a little more than architecture. It doesn't require products and it's not information. It's those things plus a whole series of other things. How do we begin to think about how we design those more effectively?
Kind of machine shop.
Yeah, yeah. It's a nice way of saying it, yeah.
Just for the record, you should maybe say something about the beautiful, talking about beautiful experiences. You can do it. Beautiful footprint into West 13th Street. There will be actually a footprint. There will be a space, a beautiful space, where beautiful experiences will actually be possible. Students who will engage in this program. So maybe you should just say that for those who are maybe thinking about that.
Yeah, so we will have a studio. We will have a kind of reconfigurable, hopefully very kind of smart studio to somehow try and support project-based work that persists over time, and to really think about, again, kind of what are the sort of material and immaterial outputs that we're making, and how do we craft those? I mean, I'm very interested in this question of ultimately the kind of craft question about how you come together around certain things, whether they're diagrams, whether they're protocols. We do it in lots of other fields, in computer science, for example, where you're designing things that are, sometimes end up being beautiful code. Just as within science, there's a lot of interesting exploration of the rhetoric of science and the power of the beautiful solution. And that it's not just effective, it's also short. So E equals mc squared being the iconic version. If you can reduce it to something poetically small, short, you've crafted a more beautiful solution than something that may be a better explanation, but has 400 different variables in it.
But I also think that the prototyping question comes back to the relevancy issue, to me at least. And I think that's the beauty of much of design, and also when we talk about design research. I mean, now there's a huge surge in the amount of basic research that we do in design, in just the basic understanding of just what you were talking about, how it develops. But to me, the prototyping part of the design process is also a very good way of making our research part more relevant, making it more tangible somehow, making it more, you can have a stance on it, you can understand it, you can somehow develop it further once you understand what it really is, whether it's a service that's prototyped or a human behavior or a product. And to me, that's really what makes a top university, is that the top research that's done there is immediately taken part into education and the society around it, and it's relevant. And there, I think, our ability to prototype is really crucial.
Yeah, and I think going back to maybe Scott's question earlier, that there is, and this is something that I could certainly see in Yochai's presentation, which is the kind of, the only word that comes to mind is kind of the delamination of the kind of vertical corporation. That is to say, part of what's created this mystique around design is this notion that we've been, for the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years of kind of corporations and management, incredibly removed from the, use the old Marxist term, the means of production. And what's really interesting in the examples that he gives, and I think in the examples that Anna gives as well, is that what you're seeing is that verticalization is starting to shrink back a little bit. And what comes of that, I think, is both the sort of demystification of the designer. So no longer is it somebody who sort of you only see in press photos or they trot it out for certain things, but it's actually somebody in your neighborhood, it's somebody on your local council, it's someone that you bump into every once in a while. And but also I think that the networks have allowed for a closer and closer sort of relationship between the sort of the user and the maker, such that kind of hierarchical separation is coming down. And I think, Yochai Winkler's point is, it also it gets us to a much more human relationship. And that's what ultimately I think his ambition is to sort of find those ways to reconnect human levels of interaction, so that the designer is no longer somebody you look up to, and the corporation is no longer something you look up to, but it's actually something that's in your neighborhood in a certain sense, that's incredibly within reach, and that's a really powerful transformation. Great, yeah, we have time for one more.
Any question about the relationship between the fine arts and applied arts in this situation? I mean, I can't. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
So first of all, I just want to say I'm really excited about this program. I'm actually a student in Milano's organizational change management program, but I actually, a couple of years back, well, about a decade ago, co-founded a nonprofit organization in Chicago that every year hosts what we used to call the Urban Sustainable Design Studio. I think they've renamed it, but basically is a transdisciplinary studio similar to like Bruce Mau or ArchiWorks in Chicago, which brings together students from multiple design disciplines to solve societal problems on the small scale as a sort of educational program. So it sounds very similar. So it's very cool that you're doing it here. But my question is sort of in the area of organizational change management, one of the keys to successful organizational change, which is really just solving a problem, is employee engagement in the process of change, or stakeholder engagement for that matter. And some of the speakers tonight have been talking about things like Wikipedia and other ways in which users are, self-selecting users are being brought into the process of creation and creativity. But what about the users who aren't necessarily the people who want to be, tinkering in their garages and, doing these, innovating, and maybe they're not posting on YouTube or whatever it is. What about engaging users in the design process as a way not only to access the wisdom of the system, but also to encourage the motivation for participation in the types of things we're talking about? I've heard of a few instances of this in healthcare, in a German healthcare network where they did a big project, but I'm curious to know if you have any insights or examples of projects where they really effectively engaged users who were not self-selecting.
Yeah, I think the term participatory design has been one of the sort of the most common and the sort of the most sort of in the air lately, and that's really been what much of it has been about. There's plenty of really good examples. There's also a lot of designers who have been developing the methods of how we could include these people in the best way. So the last example, or the second last I had, where they actually took these researchers and sort of made them participate, was done by someone called Tuuli Mattelmäki, a Finnish researcher. It's a tough name, but she actually developed probes. So that was one way of developing a set of methods with which all the participatory design could be reached, so the people themselves could actually collect the original information and you can work from there. And I think at the moment there are quite a few people who are looking at, the participatory design as such, as a way of working, has been considered quite mainstream and common, but now a lot more and more of the designers are actually looking at what new methods and ways of involving more and more people can we actually find. And I think that's one area of research which has been growing very, very heavily lately.
Cool, thanks. I think we should wrap this up.
Okay. Thank you.
We owe a great round of applause to both Katie and to Anna. There's lots more to talk about, and there's lots of food and drink. So I hope that you will join us all for a few minutes of consuming all of that. Thank you all very much.